If you love books with great storytelling, filled with memorable quotes, verbal imagery, and just plain honesty about the trials of life, then Ordering Your Private World will not disappoint you. You will most certainly walk away challenged to reevaluate whether your private world is truly ordered. So, in this book, you will be introduced to 5 essential elements that constitute an ordered private world: budgeting your time, cultivating the mind, practicing spiritual discipline, developing capital F friends, and Sabbathing. Gordon MacDonald, the author, has been a pastor and author for over 40 years. And for many years, he pastored Grace Chapel in Lexington, Massachusetts, and continues to serve as pastor emeritus. He also provided leadership to influential ministries such as InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which he served as president for 3 years, and World Relief. Gordon's best-selling books include this one, Ordering Your Private World, Mid-Course Correction, and A Resilient Life. He also writes and serves as editor-at-large for Christianity Today's leadership journal. And when not writing, leading, or speaking at conferences, Gordon and his wife Gail can be found hiking the trails of New England. Now, the central point of Gordon MacDonald's argument comes into full view with the story he tells of E. Stanley Jones, a Methodist missionary to India who, at the time, was an aged man suffering from a debilitating stroke that left him immobile and virtually speechless, but not faithless. Jones says, "I need no outer props to hold up my faith, for my faith holds me." Jones goes on to tell the story of a bishop who was struggling with retirement. Jones says the difference with him was in the texture of the things that held him. When the outer strands were broken by retirement, the inner strands were not enough to hold him. Fortunately with me, that is Jones, surrender to Jesus was the primary thing. And when the outer strands were cut by this stroke, my life didn't shake. And MacDonald goes on to make the point that the reason we must order our private world is that we don't know when the cue balls of life will strike us and send us in all directions. If our inner strands are strong, that is, surrender to Jesus and not limelightitis, we will not be shaken. We don't have control over what happens outside of us, but we do have control over what happens within us. So according to MacDonald, how do we strengthen these inner strands that are characteristics of a private world? He says, first, we must avoid the time-guzzling practice of drivenness. And Gordon spends the first 4 chapters defining the symptoms, or outlining the symptoms, and identifying those causes of drivenness. In chapters 5 through 7, he discusses ordering our time according to God's agenda. He says a key component of living as a called person is being a good steward of all the Lord has given us. Good stewards not only care for their money, but they also care for their time. Just like we budget when money is limited, we should budget our time in the same way. In chapters 8 and 9, he compares the person who doesn't make reading a priority of life to an athlete who never trains. He calls this mental flabbiness. He says that, quote, in our pressurized society, people who are out of shape mentally usually fall victim to ideas and systems that are destructive to the human spirit and to human relationships, end quote. Then he goes on to speak of how humans have a tendency, or Christians in particular, have a tendency to squander the wealth of thinking power that God built into humanity at creation. His most severe indictment is that the Christian who is not growing intellectually is like a book whose many pages remain unopened and unread. They look worn on the outside, but the pages of their life have never been opened. MacDonald's central point in this chapter is that reading increases our ability to serve God. Then he spends 4 chapters, chapters 10 through 13, discussing 5 spiritual disciplines that are essential for ordering the garden of our life. They are silence and solitude, then there's singing, then there's regularly listening to God, reflection and meditation, and lastly, prayer as worship and intercession. He says that God does not ordinarily shout to make himself heard. God tends to whisper in the garden. He says, quote, "The discipline of the Spirit depends on the willingness of men and women of Christ to seek solitude and silence, to listen for the whisper of God." Then he goes on to describe meditating as moving beyond reading and listening by entering God's word into our hearts. He calls this pressing the enter key. Now, regarding intercession, he says, the greater the spiritual authority and responsibility a person has, the more important it is that he develop intercessory capacities. MacDonald offers this personal note, stating that as he grows in his faith, he is more constrained to ask less and less for himself, but more and more for others. In chapter 14, he speaks of the need to cultivate capital F friends. Now, for many, this will be a new concept, and he admits, that's Gordon MacDonald, in the book, that he was taught as a young seminarian to only have one best friend, and that was his wife. But he has come to realize in his older age that it's okay to widen that circle a bit. And as he candidly notes, ordering one's private world is not a one-person event. Friends create an air of accountability when one is struggling with weaknesses or a fear, and they act as a Quaker clearance committee. And quoting Edward Farrell, MacDonald notes this. He says, "We shall never truly know ourselves unless we find people who can listen. We cannot discover ourselves by ourselves." And then the last chapter, chapter 15, MacDonald outlines the importance of, quote, gathering the pool balls of life, developing a regular ritual of racking them up. He calls this Sabbathing. It's a phrase that he develops that moves beyond leisure and amusement. He says it is a type of rest that brings peace to the private world. It is the time where we are able to experience regular restoration. He says when we Sabbath, earthly things assume their true size and comparative insignificance. We are able to put the past, the present, and the future within their proper context. And he rounds out the book with a beautiful epilogue that's truly reflective of a man who's tried to pursue the ordering of his private world. MacDonald recounts a crisis he recently had and reflected on how the ordering of his private world allowed him to face the challenges with courage, appreciation, and depth. And reflected in this epilogue is someone who had truly surrendered his life to Jesus. He had strengthened the innermost strands by making sure that God's words entered the garden of his private world. Happy reading.